He mapped more of the Earth than any human who ever lived. He found places no European had ever seen. And for it, he was beaten to death on a beach by the very people he'd come to meet. This is the true story of Captain James Cook. And the cost of mapping the world was more horrifying than anyone imagined. Cook was born in Yorkshire in 1728, the son of a farm labourer, and his first attempt at a working life ended in failure at a country shop before he found his footing as an apprentice in the merchant navy. The shop had been a family arrangement, a respectable trade handed to a boy who was expected to be grateful for it. He lasted 18 months. The ledgers bored him. The counting room walls closed in. He walked away and never looked back. Something in the rhythm of the sea and the precision of navigation seized hold of him and never let go. He learned to read water the way other men read scripture. He learned to chart coastlines with a draftsman's patience, marking every shoal, every headland, every sounding with a care that bordered on obsession. By his mid-20s, he was offered an attractive position with the merchant fleet. A comfortable berth, steady pay, a predictable life. The kind of position a man of his background was supposed to grab with both hands. He turned it down. In 1755, with the 7 Years' War spreading across Europe and the colonies, Cook walked into a Royal Navy recruiting office and enlisted as a volunteer. Not an officer, a volunteer. He was 27, trading certainty for chance. The Merchant Navy had trained him. The Royal Navy would test him. His navigation skills and his genius for map-making carried him upward through the ranks faster than birth or patronage ever could have. He surveyed the St. Lawrence River with such precision that his charts were still being used a century later. General Wolfe used those same maps to guide British warships upriver to Quebec. The coast of Newfoundland, the approaches to Louisbourg, Cook mapped them all. He was exact. He was relentless. He was quiet about it. During his time surveying in Newfoundland, severe accident involving a powder horn left Cook with a permanent injury to his right hand. Though he recovered, it left a distinctive, prominent scar across his hand that remained for the rest of his life. He carried that mark everywhere, into every chart he drew, into every voyage that followed. And decades later, long after his journey came to an end on a Hawaiian beach, that singular scar would be the key detail, allowing his crew to identify what remained of Captain James Cook. If you had to switch careers entirely like Cook did, leaving a safe path for a dangerous one, what trade would you have chosen back then? Let me know in the comments below. But before Hawaii, before the violence and the death, there was a mission to an island paradise. And the British Admiralty had buried a secret inside it. The mission looked straightforward. In 1768, the Royal Society needed a navigator to sail to Tahiti and record the transit of Venus across the face of the Sun. A rare astronomical event that, timed precisely from multiple points on the globe, could reveal the distance between Earth and its star. The Society needed a man who could hit exact coordinates, keep a crew of nearly 90 alive for months, and make delicate measurements with instruments worth a small fortune. They chose Cook, but the Admiralty had folded a second purpose into the voyage. Cook carried sealed orders, not to be opened until the Venus observations were complete. Those orders directed him south to find Terra Australis, the legendary continent that European geographers had insisted for centuries must exist to balance the world's land masses. If he found it, he was to chart its coast and claim sovereignty for the British Crown. The transit of Venus was the reason the voyage was funded. The continent was the reason it was launched. A mission of pure territorial ambition would have drawn scrutiny from rival powers. A mission of science, carrying astronomers and telescopes, drew none. On June 3rd, 1769, Cook successfully observed the transit of Venus across the Sun from Tahiti, interacting with the indigenous Polynesian people throughout his months on the island. The troubles began with small disappearances, nails from the ship, iron tools, a musket. Tahitian and British societies held fundamentally different understandings of property and exchange. What one culture called theft, the other may not have recognized as crime at all. But Cook's crew saw it as theft, and they grew uneasy. Cook, who had shown patience during the early weeks, responded with a tactic that bypassed negotiation entirely. He seized a Tahitian chieftain and held him hostage until the stolen items were returned. It worked. The goods came back. But something else broke on that beach. The fragile trust between the British and the people who had welcomed them. Cook never explained the decision to his officers. He simply acted. He was a formidable and disciplined leader who kept his thoughts to himself. A man who absorbed pressure in silence. A habit that would cast a long shadow over every voyage still to come. If you were leading this expedition, how would you have handled the theft without taking a hostage? Let me know in the comments below. But Tahiti was only the first landfall. Ahead lay coastlines no European chart had ever recorded. And encounters that would test Cook in ways this island paradise never did. Cook turned south and sailed into waters no European chart had ever recorded. New Zealand had been glimpsed by Abel Tasman more than a century earlier, but no one had mapped its coastline with any precision. No one knew whether it was a single landmass or something else entirely. Cook spent 6 months working the shoreline, and what he found overturned every assumption. New Zealand was not one island, it was two. He charted both coastlines with such precision that his maps were still in use well into the 20th century. But the survey came at cost. The Maori were a warrior society, organized and formidable, and first contact turned violent, with a speed that shocked everyone on board. In one encounter at what Cook called Poverty Bay, several Maori were killed after challenging the landing party. Cook recorded the event in his journal with characteristic restraint. No flourish, no apology. He was charting a world that had not asked to be charted. The deadlier enemy was not on shore. It was below decks. Scurvy had killed more sailors than every battle and storm in the history of the Royal Navy combined. Swollen gums, bleeding skin, a lethargy that crept through a ship's company after weeks without fresh provisions. Cook refused to accept it as inevitable. He imposed strict dietary rules on every man under his command. Sauerkraut, malt extract, citrus whenever landfall allowed. He prohibited the consumption of grease from copper pans, which he believed bred sickness. The rules were unpopular. The crew complained. Cook insisted. Not a single man on the Endeavour died of scurvy during the entire voyage. He pressed on to the east coast of Australia, charting thousands of miles of coastline no European had ever seen. The Endeavour survived a violent grounding on the Great Barrier Reef that nearly swallowed the ship. After limping to Batavia for repairs, disease swept through the weakened crew and killed several men within weeks. Despite those losses, the voyage returned to England as a triumph, and Cook came home a hero. He had mapped the unknown and defeated the sea's oldest killer. But a man who has pushed back the edges of the world does not sit still. The Admiralty was already preparing a second voyage, and Cook, restless, insatiable, still hungry, would soon sail farther south than any man had ever gone, into waters that would test him in ways the tropics never had. Cook had been home barely a year. The Admiralty's orders were already written. The goal this time was Terra Australis, the vast southern continent that European geographers had insisted must exist to balance the weight of the northern hemisphere. Cook sailed in July 1772 with 2 ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, provisioned for 3 years at sea. He sailed south, past the Cape of Good Hope, past the southern tip of Africa, into waters no European vessel had ever entered. The cold came gradually, then all at once. Fog thickened into ice. Waves froze as they broke against the hull, coating the rigging in frost that sailors chipped away with axes before they could raise or lower a single sail. Icebergs appeared, first scattered, then in fields that stretched to the horizon. White walls 100 feet high, no visible end in any direction. On January 17, 1773, Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle. No commander in history had done it before. The Resolution pushed to 67 degrees south before pack ice closed around her and forced her back. He tried again the following summer, pressing deeper, reaching 71 degrees south. A latitude no ship would surpass for nearly 50 years. He found no continent. He found no land at all. Just ice and fog, and a sea so empty it seemed to mock the very idea that anything could lie beyond it. The continent geographers had dreamed of for centuries was not there. Cook had proven it himself, and he wrote the proof in his logs in language as flat and final as the horizon. The voyage that killed Terra Australis was also the voyage that began to unmake the man who searched for it. Cook fell ill. Not the kind of illness that flared and passed, but a deep, grinding exhaustion that settled into his body and would not leave. He was 45 years old. His frame had absorbed years of cold, damp, and sleepless nights across 3 oceans. Now it began to fail him. Stomach pains that came without warning. Fevers that rose and broke without pattern. A heaviness that showed in his face, and in the slower way he moved through the ship's narrow passages. He hid it from his crew, as he hid most things. But the logs tell the story in what they leave out. Days where his entries shrink to a few clipped words. Weeks where the hand that had charted thousands of miles of coastline grows cramped and uneven, as though the pen had become difficult to hold. He pressed on through the South Pacific, charting islands and passages no European had recorded. The expedition returned to England in 1775 with the loss of only 4 men. A staggering achievement in an age where scurvy and disease routinely claimed half a ship's company. But the crew had left something behind in those islands. Diseases from European ports that spread through Polynesian communities with a speed no one had anticipated. A legacy of contact that would outlast every line Cook ever drew on a map. He came home altered. The illness had not killed him, but it had taken something. Some reserve of strength, some elasticity of mind. That he would not fully recover. He was promoted. Celebrated. Feted by the Royal Society. The most accomplished navigator alive. But the man who sailed back into Portsmouth was not the same man who had sailed out. And the sea was not finished with him. It would call him back one more time, on a voyage that would demand more than all the others combined, and break him in ways no chart could have predicted. He was nearly 50 years old. He had a comfortable retirement waiting for him in England. A house, a pension, the admiration of a nation that had already decided he was the greatest navigator alive. Cook cast it all aside. The Admiralty wanted someone to find the Northwest Passage, the fabled sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific through the Arctic, and there was only one man they trusted to do it. So Cook sailed again, and the voyage that began with such promise will become something else entirely. The first signs were subtle. A loss of motivation that crept in slowly. The kind of shift a crew might attribute to fatigue or age or the grinding accumulation of years at sea. Cook had always been disciplined, precise, a man who kept his own counsel and held his temper in check even when Tahitian chiefs tested his patience and Maori warriors challenged his authority. That man was disappearing. In his place emerged someone darker, someone unpredictable. He burned villages when islanders stole from his ships, and they did, repeatedly, as they had on every voyage before. Cook no longer responded with the measured tactics that had defined his earlier command. He responded with fire. Entire settlements reduced to ash over a missing sextant or a stolen goat. On one occasion, he ordered the ears of thieves cut off, a punishment so disproportionate that even his own officers struggled to justify it in their journals. The man who had once taken a chieftain hostage to recover his belongings had operated from cold, tactical logic. This was something different. This was cruelty without purpose, and the crew knew it even if they could not say it aloud. The Northwest Passage eluded him. Ice and snow packed the Arctic channels so thick that the Resolution could not push through, and Cook found himself staring at walls of white where a navigable route should have been. The Admiralty believed the passage existed. The ice said otherwise. What happened next defied every instinct that had made Cook extraordinary. Rather than pressing the search or returning to England to report his findings, Cook made a decision his officers could not explain and that history has struggled to rationalize. He turned south, away from the Arctic, away from his mission, away from everything that made sense. He told his crew they were escaping the cold, but escape implies a plan, and Cook seemed to have none. He was drifting now, a man unmoved from the discipline that had defined his life, sailing into the vast Pacific with no clear destination and no clear reason. Then, on a January morning in 1778, the horizon changed. Land rose from the sea, lush volcanic islands no European had charted, rising from deep blue water like something conjured. The Hawaiian Islands. And what waited for him that would make every act of cruelty on this voyage seem like a prelude. The timing was everything. Cook arrived during Makahiki, the annual festival honoring Lono, god of fertility, peace, and agricultural abundance. Hawaiian tradition held that Lono would return during this season, arriving from the sea in a canoe draped in white banners. Cook's ships, their masts dressed in white canvas, their crews arriving from across the open ocean, matched the prophecy with an almost theatrical precision that neither side fully grasped. The Hawaiians greeted him not as a visitor, but as the god himself. Priests conducted rituals. Thousands brought offerings of pigs, fruit, and kapa cloth. Cook accepted it all with a silent composure that had defined his command, and for 2 weeks the bay existed in a state of suspended peace. He was not a stranger. He was not a mortal. He was divine. When Resolution and Discovery finally weighed anchor and sailed north, the ritual cycle seemed complete. Lono had departed, as tradition demanded, and the season of Ku, the god of war, could begin. But a snapped foremast forced Resolution back to Kealakekua Bay, and Cook returned at the worst possible moment. He was not supposed to come back. The festival had ended. The white banners should not have reappeared. In the eyes of the Hawaiians, something was deeply wrong, and the reverence that had greeted his arrival curdled into suspicion within days. The theft of a ship's cutter, small but essential to the expedition's operations, pushed Cook to a decision that revealed how far he had drifted from the careful strategist he had once been. He would take the king hostage. It was a tactic he had used before in Tahiti in New Zealand. A blunt instrument of leverage that had worked because he understood those cultures well enough to calibrate the pressure. But this was not Tahiti. He did not read Hawaiian politics the way he had read the islands he had charted years earlier, and the man who had once navigated indigenous power structures with surgical precision was now operating on exhaustion, illness, and something darker. On the morning of February 14th, 1779, Cook marched ashore with a small contingent of Marines and asked King Kalani'lopokud to walk with him to the Resolution. The king agreed, at first. Then a chief intervened. Word spread that a warrior had been killed in a skirmish across the bay, and the crowd turned. Cook raised his musket. He fired once. The beach erupted in minutes. Hawaiian warriors overwhelmed the landing party, and Cook was beaten and stabbed where he stood at the water's edge. The warriors who killed him then prepared his body according to high-status funerary rites reserved for chiefs. An act of reverence, not desecration, though no one watching from the ships could see it that way. The man who had mapped more of the world's coastline than any European alive had been absorbed into the very world he had come to claim. What he left behind. In charts, in journals, in the routes he carved through unknown seas, would redraw the map of the world itself and open doors that could never again be closed. The charts Cook produced were documents of extraordinary precision, drawn by a man who had trained his eye to see what others missed. Some remained in use into the 20th century. More than 200 years after his hand first committed those coastlines to paper. He charted New Zealand, the eastern seaboard of Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, the volcanic islands scattered across thousands of miles of the South Pacific, and the ice-choked waters guarding a continent no European had ever laid eyes on. Each headland was fixed with coordinates, each harbour rendered in fine detail, each passage marked for the ships that would follow. His maps made the Pacific legible to Europe, and that legibility paved the way for colonization that would reshape the region and its peoples for centuries. The chilling truth behind Cook's death was never really hidden. It was a trajectory. The man who had spent his life imposing order on the unknown, charting it, naming it, making it navigable, had been undone by the slow erosion of everything that had made him exceptional. His judgment, his patience, his ability to read a moment and respond with measured calm. On that Hawaiian beach, none of it held. The navigator who had guided crews through ice and reef and storm could not navigate a confrontation of his own making. He had mapped the edges of the world. He could not map the edges of himself. The charts outlived the man. They are still outliving him.